Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to have Luis Ball come to speak to us about Latin America. He has a son who's a student here, but he did leave Florida to come all the way here in January. So I really appreciate that, especially given the weather today. This originated because I was at the Board of Trustees meeting last spring, my first act as the incoming dean. And we had all these meetings, and it was quite exhausting. But at lunch, we sat with several other people at a table, and he started to discuss and talk about Latin America. And it was absolutely mesmerizing. All of us at the table had no desire to go back to the Board of Trustees meetings. And for many of us who have this curiosity about the entire continent, but get so little information and know so little, it was absolutely like an oasis. So I invited him to come and actually talk to all of the rest of us about it, and he agreed. So thank you for agreeing. Luis was born in Venezuela, and he's a Carnegie Mellon alumnus with a degree in managerial economics. He's an active and generous member of our Board of Trustees, and we're very fortunate to have him here with us today for a talk on something that's very close to his heart, the difference between our perception of Latin America and its reality. So for many reasons, Luis has a unique perspective on this topic. First, he grew up there. Second, he is an international business leader in Latin America. Currently, he is the chairman and chief executive officer of the Grupo Ciencia and Allegheny Medical Systems, both in Boca Raton, Florida. And they're engaged in distribution of high-tech medical devices in over a dozen Latin American countries. Third, he is also the publisher of Pan Am Post, a rich online site that covers news generally, but in particular offers excellent in-depth analyses of news and issues centered in Central and South America. Fourth, Luis is a member of the Latin American Business Council, a director of the Nucorpa ad agency in Caracas, Venezuela, and of Telares de Palo Grande, a textile company listed on the Caracas Exchange. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of Choate Rosemary Hall, the prestigious secondary school in Connecticut, and he's also on the board of the World's Presidents Organization, and was a 20-year member of the Young Presidents Organization. Several Dietrich college students had the opportunity to be in a roundtable with discussion with Luis today. It was fantastic. So as dean, I've assigned him to teach a course on Latin America for the rest of the semester. And I'm sure he's happy to put his business life in Florida aside to spend the remainder of the winter with us in Pittsburgh. So thanks to the University Lecture Series for co-sponsoring today's lecture with the Dietrich College. Without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce Luis Ball and have him speak to us.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm very, very glad to be here. And it's the first time I ever get to speak from this position at Carnegie Mellon. I always sitting over there listening. So, I find it a little challenging to be here. As I was saying before, there's so many people here that could probably speak about Latin America with more knowledge than I do. And one of the things I did before coming here, I was looking at old papers of my time in Carnegie Mellon, and I found a letter from Dean Elliott to the parents in 1978, telling the parents that he was concerned that over half of the freshman class was in academic warning. That was the first time. And I said, well, Carnegie Mellon is much better today. Yeah. I would probably not have gotten in with the standards today, but I think this kind of thing doesn't happen also because the students are not only academically better, but a big reason is that now there's a lot more women on campus, which has improved a lot. Getting to the subject of Latin America, and as I said, it's a favorite topic of mine is how Latin America is perceived in the United States and what it really is. And another favorite topic, which I think is a favorite topic of all Latin Americans, is why is Latin America the way it is? Why is it so messy? I mean, why we have such rich countries in terms of resources, and sometimes we have great educated people, creative societies, and yet we don't seem to get off the ground. Korea went from nothing in the 1950s to being a powerhouse. Taiwan, you know, all these countries that were behind Latin America 50 or 60 years ago. So, you know, I like to share my thoughts about this. This is like probably the national sport in Latin America. We're all talking about these issues. Why are the way we are? And I just probably organized my thoughts, and Richard happened to hear me, and here I am. So the first thing when we talk about Latin America and we try to explain Latin America to an American audience is, the first thing is that we have to understand Latin America is a big place. The US, people in America generally that I meet think that Latin American countries are these little countries in Latin America. That's the first misconception. Latin American is a big place. Argentina superimposed over the east coast of the US, is larger than the entire US territory east of the Mississippi. And it's just one of 11 countries in South America. So you can imagine, I mean, the landmass that we're talking about is enormous. And Argentina, which again, you know, is larger than the eastern part of the US, only has about 30 million people in it. So it's a large country with lots of empty space, as most South American countries are. So that's the first misconception. And talking about this misconception, you know, is expanding on this issue. Brazil is larger than the continental US, much larger, about a third larger than the continental US. Colombia is three times larger than Germany, which is the largest country in Western Europe. A flight between Mexico City and Sao Paulo is double the distance of a transcontinental flight. And the Amazon River runs almost 4,000 miles. So it's, you know, it's a big place. And so the size and the population make it a very diverse place, much more diverse than is commonly thought about. So that's the first thing we have to keep in mind when trying to understand Latin America. It's a very big place. And I'm going to talk a little bit about other stereotypes and misconceptions, and I want to say that some of them are based on reality. I'm not, you know, some of them are actually true. I mean, I was talking to a group of friends, and most people here have seen that show Modern Family. And when you see Sofia Vergara in Modern Family, and you see that character, you say, well, the scriptwriters are great. They created this character played by Sofia Vergara. You know, these are great scriptwriters. No, actually, that character exists. That is my sister, Leonor. So, I mean, there's some stereotypes are true. Generally, the American view of a Latin American street scene would be something like this, generally speaking. I mean, of course, some people are more informed, but that's what, you know, people think about when they think Latin America. And normally they think Latin Americans live in places like this. You know, a small town, you know, with a large church and these little houses there somewhere out in nowhere. That's true, there are towns like that. That's an actual picture of an actual town. But the reality is that most Latin Americans live in places like this. This is where 70 or 80% of the population live. This is the way it looks for the average Latin American. They live in large, cosmopolitan cities with large, complex problems of large cities. So even despite your last vacation in Cabo, all of Mexico doesn't look like Cabo, okay? So it happens that way. But also this reality is also true. There's a lot of poverty in Latin America. That's undeniable. And why do we have these two societies living side by side is part of why we, you know, I'll try to talk about today. There's something also I'd like to mention is that, again, I'm not an academic, and I'm going to touch on an issue which is rarely touched on when people talk about Latin America, which is race. You know, I just want to say, started out, that if some of you have stronger opinions or you have particular instances that you feel that should be highlighted, I welcome the comments. I don't want to belittle any group in any way, and I'm just talking here in general terms. But this is an issue that, in order to understand Latin America, we have to discuss the issue of race. And it's an important issue, and people don't normally associate it either with Latin America, but you'll see why I make this point. First of all, we have to go back to 1492. And you have to understand, from the American point of view, you know, of colonial days, is the Pilgrims, you know, and the Puritans and all this. Well, that's the 17th century. With the 17th century ethos and the 17th century mentality, that's what colonial America looked like. But Latin America was formed by Christopher Columbus arriving in 1492. And the world in 1492 looked like this, as Richard III about to get his head cut off. It was a medieval age with medieval thinking and medieval thoughts and a medieval ethos of the population and the people in the world. And the fact that Columbus arrived in 1492 and the medieval mind was still very much predominant at that time is an important factor to remember. So the Spanish arrived in 1492. That's 130 years before the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth Rock. That's a generation before Martin Luther and the Reformation. That's almost a century before Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. And a century before Shakespeare wrote his first play. So just think about, you know, the difference in time and the mentality of the time when Columbus arrived. The other thing on the map is there is for a reason. Spain was probably the first strong unified state in Western Europe. And it became a strong unified state just a few years before Columbus arrived, when the Kingdom of Castile joined with the Kingdom of Aragon into one country because of the marriage of the Catholic kings. And one thing to understand is that Aragon, that became integral part of Spain, of the new country that was called Spain, with these two countries joined together, was already heavily involved in European politics. The Kingdom of Aragon, with its capital or main trading city, not the capital of Barcelona, was a naval powerhouse that already dominated most of Italy. And it was heavily involved, because of that reason, in European power struggles and so forth. And the reason Columbus arrives in Spain is that Genoa was a vassal state to the Kingdom of Aragon. Genoa had lost a war, the Republic of Genoa, with Aragon and so forth, and it was pretty much a vassal state. That's why there was so much contact with Italy, was why Genovese appears in Spain, you know, proposing to saying the world is round and all this. But that's an important factor, because Spain was already a European power before it discovered America, and it was already heavily involved in European politics. So Columbus arrives, but he did not arrive the way the British arrived in North America. It wasn't a patent to develop anything. It wasn't people escaping from religious persecution. Columbus arrived on behalf of the crown of Spain. He was a representative of the Spanish state. He had a royal notary land with him in San Salvador. So he came in as a representative of the crown of Spain, with all the meanings that all that had in the Middle Ages. The crown had properties. It was, you know, even in England today, you have, you know, you have the royal family with property. The Duke of Cornwall is the Prince of Wales, and so forth, with all kinds of properties. He was a representative of the crown. And he was, which is very important, he was a representative of the crown of Castile, because even though the two kings ruled together, the Catholic kings, until their daughter or their son ruled, these Aragon and Castile kept their separate laws, and they had even separate traditions and separate languages. He came on behalf of Queen Isabella of Spain, who was the Queen of Castile. And something that is not quite understood is that what we call Spanish as a language is not Spanish, it's Castilian. And he came in with the laws, to apply the laws of Castile, which are very particular and have a lot of influence later on. So what the Spanish brought when they arrived was they brought the state, and the first modern state in Europe, and they brought the church. And this is the same year that Columbus arrives, is the year that the Spanish finally get the last Muslim out of Granada. And this religious fervors, the 700-year effort to impose Christianity on the Iberian Peninsula is successful. And this is, again, this is the Middle Ages. People went to Mass on a daily basis. It wasn't just on Sundays. They went to Mass every day. And the church was a huge influence. And these were the Catholic kings who were also particularly devout. So that's something that has to be understood. Columbus came as a representative of the crown, and he brought with him the state and the church as two large institutions from the very beginning. So this is entirely different from colonial processes elsewhere. Initially, there was a lot of lawlessness. I mean, the Indian villages were pillaged, Indians were enslaved. I mean, I'm sorry about the word Indians, by the way. Indigenous peoples, you know, I didn't mean to, but there was a lot of mayhem and violence and violation of all kinds of human rights on the Indians. And again, I got that word stuck. In my mind, it's tradition, I guess. We use it a lot in Spanish. That's why I keep going back to the word. Anyway, this was on a massive scale, even though it is, I mean, probably the experts here know that most of the destruction of the native population was due to illnesses or disease that came with the conquistadors. There was massive acts of killing by the Spanish and slavery. However, that was not the policy of the crown. And while this was going on, there was there you have a copy of the famous book by Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest that wrote an account of the terrors that the Spanish inflicted on the native population. While this was going on, there were debates in the University of Salamanca and other places in Spain on whether the Native Americans had souls, the indigenous people of the Americas had souls, and whether they were real humans with souls. They had academic debates and they had experts discussing the issue and so forth. And the conclusion was that yes, they were humans and they had souls, and therefore they had rights, and therefore they could not be enslaved. That was the official conclusion of a royal panel established to investigate this issue. So it is an extremely important issue because from that point on, even though there was a lot of abuse and you can call it a slavery in a way going on with Indians, it was illegal. The abuse went on in many places for centuries, but it was illegal. It was against the established law of the Spanish crown and the Portuguese crown in Brazil to violate the native population's rights. So eventually the state, and this happened, by the way, in a great part of the reason why this happened is because the church was deadly opposed to harming or abusing the native population. 3 popes declared the action of enslaving Indians the actions of the devil. And actually the church kept threatening to excommunicate people who acted against Indians or native population and killed the native population and so forth. This went on, and it was the official policy of the church to condemn these acts. So eventually, under a lot of pressure from the church, the Spanish crown issued laws protecting the native population. These laws were badly designed, yes. These laws did not entirely protect the native population, yes. But these laws saved the native population from extermination, which is not what happened in other places. But it's very, very important that because the enactment of these laws saved the native populations in many places in Latin America and made Latin America eventually different, and I'll elaborate on that. Eventually, the king's, or it actually is a misprint, it should be the queen's wishes. This is words from the Queen Isabella. She stated her wishes very, very clearly. I wish the Indians to be treated as anybody who would want to convert to Christianity and save their souls. That was the mentality of the time. And the person who, these were actually written instructions to a governor in Spanish America. Somebody who writes that doesn't have the aim of destroying the native population. So the result of these laws protecting the native population, the laws were complex. I mean, the natives had to offer their services for free to Spanish conquistadors to till the land or something like that in exchange for receiving the benefits of Christianity. Okay? And they were pretty much indentured vassals of the Spanish. But there was an escape clause. If the native, if someone was the product of a marriage between a native and a Spaniard, he would automatically not be considered a native anymore. He would be considered a free man. So the natives knew that if, you know, they fathered or they actually gave birth, the women gave birth to a person of mixed race, he would be completely free of any obligation under any law. He would be considered a free man. And of course, there were hardly any women in Spanish America early on. First of all, I mean, again, these were not commercial enterprises bringing people over as it happened in the British colonial period. You needed a special permission, and it was incredibly complicated just to get on a ship and go to Spanish America in the 16th century. So there were hardly any women. So for the first time, I mean, there are instances in world history where races mixed, and you know, you talk about the Greeks in Afghanistan and things like this. But in this scale, this was probably the only time in the world where this happened, where the great majority of the population became a mix of the Spanish, European blood, and the local Indian population. And in every country in Latin America, percentages vary, but the majority of the population is of mixed race. There's no such thing, as a country in Latin America. Probably the Southern Cone, the Argentina, Uruguay are the exception, but still, I would argue that the majority of the population in almost every country is a mixed race. And the reason was you would become a free citizen with rights if you were born as a mixed-raced person. So for 300 years, and this lasted, I mean, just think about it, 300 years longer than the United States has been in existence. the Spanish established rules for society that worked like this. The noblemen were, were the people on top, as in everywhere in Europe. White colonials had special rights and privileges. And then there were the pardos, and I use the word pardos, not the American word, because mestizo is has an Americanized meaning and an anglicized meaning. Pardos is the word the Spanish used to describe the people of mixed race, and the word means in Spanish brown. It's a word for the color brown. Okay? Pardos were free citizens with less rights than the white colonials. They could not hold office. They could not be officers in the army or in the militia. They could engage in commerce. They could engage in any activity, but they could not hold any position of power or importance. But there was one escape clause in the laws that were established. Originally, and I have to go back, the Spain, during the days of the Catholic kings, the Spanish look at the world in terms of Christian and non-Christian. They didn't look at the world in the racial terms. So when the Jews were expelled from Spain, it wasn't because, as in the 20th century, we would know the German mentality of the Jewish race. When the Spanish expelled the Jews, it was, we will expel all Jews who do not convert to Christianity. Those who convert to Christianity are free to stay. The same thing happened with the Muslims. So there wasn't any issue of race. Race comes up later in the Americas in an effort, and for reasons that have to do with the Spanish nobility, to, let's say, organize what was going on in Spain. Because there are complaints that the nobility was being infiltrated by these brown people that came from the Americans. So the laws began to develop what happened. Initially, it wasn't like that. Initially, the daughters of Moctezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, moved freely in the palace of the kings of Spain. They were welcome as nobles in the palace of kings of Spain. So these were laws that were developed over time, but once they were set, they stayed for 300 years. So the pardos had rights as if they were Spanish citizens, and with one escape clause. What the Spanish established that in order to get a public post or become an officer in the army, you needed a certificate of purity of blood. And the certificate of purity of blood required that you had no Jewish blood for 3 generations, no Muslim blood for 3 generations, and no Indian blood for 3 generations. So all you needed to do was wait 3 generations, and then you could opt for your descendants could be officers or whatever. So eventually this had an effect because, again, the period was very long. What you could not do was have black blood. You know, blacks were considered almost not human, and they were enslaved. And it was like that from the very beginning. I mean, there are letters by even priests saying that, okay, since the Indians have souls, let's bring in some black slaves who are not human and use them as slaves. But the Spanish had a big conflict with slavery. The Portuguese had no conflict with slavery, and we talk about Brazil, it's a different story within Latin America. Portuguese have been trading slaves and enslaving black populations since way before Columbus arrived in America. And they already were in Western Africa, and I mean, the Portuguese had no qualms about this. The Spanish had a problem because of the influence of the church in Spain. It was much bigger, it was much more of an influence in Spain. And the church was dead set against slavery, officially. And there are many instances of priests, and even some have become saints in the Catholic world, of defending the slaves from their masters and so forth. So this was a constant struggle between church and the laws that allowed slavery. So depending on who was king and how the relations with the Vatican were, the slave trade went up or down. And it was limited in many countries. I mean, there are countries where there was almost no presence of slaves. There were black slaves in every country, but in some cases it was minimal because of the opposition of the church. And you have to think about it that for 300 years, even today, the influence of the church in Latin America is enormous. If a bishop threatens you with excommunication, or a bishop declare you a person of low moral standing, you will be ostracized in society. So even though slavery was common in some countries, it wasn't a universal issue as it was for example, in the Portuguese colonies. So it's an important fact. And the other thing is that one has to understand about slavery in the Spanish countries is that the peak of slavery came almost at the end of the Spanish Empire, towards the 18th and the 19th centuries. The number of slaves picks up a lot when the French Bourbons become kings of Spain. And towards the end of the 19th century with the sugar boom or the middle and the end of the 19th century, sugar booms in Cuba. During the beginning of the Spanish period, there was widespread slavery, but the numbers were low because of this conflict with the church. So by 1540, the Spanish had built great cities. Not only had they built great cities, they had built universities. The University of San Marcos in Lima is, I believe it's 1545 or 1542, don't remember the exact date, has a royal warrant creating the university. They had built this entire new society where these laws with this very set, you can call them apartheid laws in a way, establishing the way society worked, were set on stone. By 1790, the Spanish Empire was secure in 300 years of stability and tradition. The Spanish Empire went all the way from southern Canada to Patagonia. St. Louis was a city subject to the King of Spain in 1790. And it seemed an empire that was beyond the possibility of being dismembered. Remember, the Spanish also ruled over the Philippines and other parts of the world. And this empire, which is something really not taken into account in English language literature, was backed by great naval power throughout history. It is well known that England ruled the waves, and England was a naval power. What is not known is that, yes, the Spanish Armada was defeated partly by a storm and partly by Sir Francis Drake and so forth, in 1588. But it's not known that the next year the British fleet was defeated when they tried to attack the Spanish in Spain. And this went on for 300 years. The great naval rivalry in history was Spain and England for 300 years, with the Dutch going in the middle for a few years there. But it was literally the French, the Spanish and the British for 300 years. And in this case, the ship I put there in both pictures is called the Santísima Trinidad. I put it there just to show how much its rivalry went on. The Santísima Trinidad was the world's largest battleship for 30 years. It was a Spanish ship. The British had nothing of that size. And that's the battle, that's in battle with Admiral Nelson's flagship, the Victory, which was a smaller ship than the Santísima Trinidad. The Spanish had really an enormous fleet, and it's little known also that in the Battle of Trafalgar, most of the ships were Spanish, even though the admiral in charge was French. So the naval power made made the Spanish empire secure, very secure. And the Spanish naval power had a big role in the American Revolution for many reasons, and you can talk about that later. The photo on the right is a replica of the Santísima Trinidad that is in Malaga, Spain now. So this man in the picture is Francisco de Miranda, called the initiator of revolution in Spanish America. He was a very typical Latin American. He was a pardo. He did not have pure blood, but he was able to prove 3 generations of non-Indian, not having Indian blood. So he got a commission in the army. And he became an officer in the Spanish army. He fought in the siege of Pensacola during the American Revolutionary War. He went to France and became a general in the revolutionary armies of France. He's the only person from the Americas whose name appears in the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. He was the lover of Catherine the Great. And so he's a great personality, this guy, very interesting guy. And he was the first one to try to instill revolution in Spanish America. So in 1805 and 1806, he goes in with a band of people trying to cause revolution, say, let's go ask for independence, let's emulate the United States. And of course, he goes nowhere. He was nearly captured and so forth. And after years of trying, he gives up. He says only a miracle can produce independence for Spanish America. Why? Because after 300 years, society was set. White colonials thought of themselves as Spanish in America. They had no interest in being disloyal to the king. The laws were extensive. The Spanish power was great. The Spanish Navy was there. It was impossible. So only a miracle would cause the independence. And then miracles happened. What happened was Nelson sunk the Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, most of it. So it took a big weapon that Spain had to keep their empire, just took it out of the picture. And then Napoleon invaded Spain and put his brother on the throne. The moment Napoleon put his brother on the throne, that was it for the Spanish Empire, because there's no way that these people with 300 years tradition of loyalty to the crown would have accepted a French king in the throne of Spain. And that's what caused the beginning of independence of these colonies. And independence started out like this. It started out very similar to what you see in the US as, the Declaration, signing of the Declaration of Independence. A bunch of people dressed in 18th century outfits, being very courteous and declaring independence. But what happened, and this is key, what happened in Latin America is entirely different from what happened in the US in the Revolutionary Wars. Because the Spanish, in many countries, realized they were in a minority. There were only a few regular Spanish troops throughout the continent. Most of the armed forces were militia controlled by the local, they were locally born militia. And loyal to, let's say, the people in power in these places were, mostly either local noblemen or local wealthy people. So the Spanish realized they were outnumbered. The other guys had a bigger army, and they were wanted independence. And they had no way of countering this. What they thought of, it was in a way brilliant, but in a way is part of the reason why we have so many problems in Latin America today, is they decided to offer black slaves their freedom if they defended the king. And the pardos, they offered the white people's properties if they fought for the king. This happened in Mexico, it happened in Peru, it happened in Venezuela in a large extent. So this was not a war of independence of the British against the colonials, or the Hanoverians against the colonials or whatever. This was a civil war, and it became a racial war. It was the black population and the Pardo population killing the white population of wealthy landowners who were the ones for independence. If you see this picture, you see Simón Bolívar in the middle in the white horse. He's mostly surrounded by white men, and he's fighting a man who looks like an Indian. It should be the other way around. I mean, if you think about it, you know, the local hero is is an indigenous person and so forth. It wasn't that way for most of the revolutionary wars in Latin America. This action by the Spanish turned a war of independence. It was not a war of independence. It was a major civil war. And the patriots reacted with laws that we called, they're called the war to the death. War to the death meant, and Simón Bolívar issued a decree with these exact words. It said, it was addressed to Colombians, which you called Greater Colombia, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Colombians, count with your life even if you have betrayed the cause of liberty. Spanish and people from the Canary Islands, count with your death even if you're innocent. In other words, we will exterminate the Spanish population in reprisal for your having used the local population against us. So it became the most atrocious war you can think of. The patriots would get to a town and they would ask somebody to say the word naranja, which means orange, which we in Latin America say naranja. If the person would say naranja, with a much thicker J, the way the Spanish say it from Spain, he would be taken out and shot. Just because of your accent. And this went on and on everywhere. Locally, I mean, the native Spanish population from the Iberian Peninsula was wiped out everywhere. I mean, tens of thousands were executed. And this went on for 16 years in this landmass that I told you about. Simón Bolívar marched twice the distance of Paris to Moscow in various battles. There were battles here that were unbelievable for Western. There was a battle in Ecuador, the Battle of Pichincha, where it was fought so high up in the mountains, it was something like 15,000 feet up, that gunpowder wouldn't ignite. So it is 10,000 people fighting each other with swords, as if they were in the Middle Ages, because their gunpowder wouldn't ignite. So the war was savage, and the result was devastation everywhere. But the only result was not devastation, local devastation, where the wars of revolution happened. While Spain was trying to keep its empire in America, Spain had been invaded by Napoleon. And they have their own war of independence. They call it a war of independence in Spain. It's this war of independence against Napoleon. And Spain was also devastated. After the Napoleonic Wars, Spain was a mess. Not only was a mess economically, it was destroyed. Some of their biggest cities were in shambles. It also started a period of instability with civil war in Spain itself. So unlike the United States, where after the wars of revolution, it could just go back to trade with its mother country and establish relations and so forth, that wasn't possible for the Spanish-speaking countries. Spain was a mess, and it was ruled by a king that refused to acknowledge the independence of its former colonies. So Spain took almost 50 years to reestablish relations with its former colonies. But it was worse than that, because in the English-speaking countries, you have the common law. So the English left, but you had common law. You had the local customs and laws that had been in place before independence were still going on. John Adams was a lawyer before independence. He could be a lawyer the next day. The laws hadn't changed. Just the Privy Council wasn't the Supreme Court, but it was the same set of laws. In Spanish America, it was different. All previous laws were done away with by all governments. And the fashionable thing was to establish the Napoleonic Code everywhere, some to more degree than others. So you had an entirely set of laws being enacted, which nobody knew really how to manage. And it was a real chaotic time in all of Latin America, and it couldn't go back to normalcy. You had a black population of slaves or former slaves that had been promised freedom by the Spanish and then promised freedom by the other side, so they would abandon the Spanish. You had a Pardo population that had been offered property and rights, and they wanted property and rights. And you have a group of people that all they wanted was to reestablish order. We want order back. We want things the way they were. And these are the people who wanted order. And they kept enacting laws and so forth, but the genie was out. And so the situation was very chaotic. While some people wanted order, some others wanted a new order. And this is the conflict that we have had in Latin America since the days of independence. Some people want to change now, and I want to change now because somebody offered it to me. And other people say, forget about change, we've got to put the house in order. And this has been the permanent conflict of Latin America. And it comes from this period where institutions were wiped out completely, all institutions. And new institutions were created. And just a break here to mention that Brazil was different for a time. And the difference being that when Napoleon invaded Portugal, the king of Portugal left for Brazil and ruled as king in Brazil. So the Portuguese were able to keep Brazil because the king was in Brazil. There was no way somebody was going to rise up. Eventually, the Brazilians wanted to avoid the province of Spanish America, also wanted to get rid of the Portuguese, but what they said is, we'll take one of the kings of Portugal's sons and name him emperor. And this is the way Brazil was until the 1890s. So Brazil was much more stable for a time because Brazil had the monarchy, and it kept traditions, and it kept laws, and it kept everything until the 1890s, much longer than in the Spanish world. But eventually this conflict of order versus change now generated violence all over Latin America for a century. In every country, some more, some less. It was constant civil war, and the civil wars were in large part pardos against whites. And that has to be understood. The whites wanted order, the pardos wanted rights and property and so forth. And this conflict went on and on. And I mean, we can talk about the various civil wars in various countries. And I mention you a case in Venezuela where in what we call the Federal War, which was a civil war that lasted 5 years, a person who happens to be the great-great-grandfather of Hugo Chavez was an Indian called Maisanta. And he was a general, quote unquote, in the liberal army who were fighting the conservatives. And their slogan was to kill the oligarchs. So Maisanta would go into a city like Barinas, which was the largest city in Venezuela in those days, a big city, very prosperous because of cattle hives and so forth. And they would, when they took the city, they would ask people to read a piece of paper. They would line up all the citizens of Barinas and say, read this piece of paper. And whoever read it was put on one side. Whoever said cannot read would be put on the other side. After everybody had read the paper or said I can't read, those who had read the paper were shot because they were oligarchs. This is the kind of thing that went on. And this went on in many countries, in many instances. And I can tell, aside from the opposite story, in Argentina there was a war to civilize the South. And it was a war of extermination against the native population. So this is this happened all over the 19th century. And let's say the controversy was order versus change, order versus a new order. And this was a constant. And of course, what happened was really what's going on. Some people were searching for utopia. Some countries in Latin America had in their constitutions universal suffrage before any country in Europe, which was crazy. I mean, you didn't even have an organized state, and here you were offering universal suffrage in the constitution. So in a way, this search for utopia and the search for order were this constant, produces constant violence. I put this picture there because it's an actual picture of the Mexican Revolution. You see the people who are firing that cannon and firing the rifles? These are gentlemen in bowler hats. You know, I mean, this is really, you know, unbelievable when you think about it. So this conflict produced really strange governments. This is Lázaro Cárdenas, former president of Chile, and this is the slogan of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It's an oxymoron. Okay, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It was the dominant party of Mexican politics for 75 years. They are back in power now, by the way. But they're a different party today than they used to be, but it's officially the same party. They were in power in Mexico for 75 years. And what they said was they talked the language of revolution that the people wanted, the majority wanted. But at the same time, they promised the order that some other people wanted. Of course, that came at a price. The price was corruption and press censorship and so forth. But because they were selling these two ideas at the same time, they were able to hold on to power for 75 years. It was brilliant, if you think about it. And sometimes this promise generates a new type of ruler, which is not clearly understood in the US either. The US dictators are army generals who are rightist and capitalist, and they are dictators. Well, it's not that way. Most of the dictators had, you know, very progressive language to their, you know, to their politics. The guy on the left, you know, the guy on the right is Fidel Castro. The guy on the left is General Juan Velasco Alvarado. He's an army general, the head of the Peruvian army, who gave a coup d'etat. He toppled an elected president in the name of socialism. The Peruvian army made a coup d'etat in the name of socialism. They aligned themselves with Russia. They changed the uniforms of the army to Russian uniforms, Soviet uniforms at the time, and they became allies of Fidel Castro. Because it was very smart of them. You know, they were speaking the language that some people wanted to hear, and yet they were a military group in power. And of course, the other new type of ruler is Fidel Castro, and I won't expand on that. He's, you know, he's just, let's say, a Soviet-style ruler. What I just point out in the picture, he's wearing a Rolex Submariner in that picture. So this search for utopia and this search for new rulers that, you know, satisfied the people's anxiety for a new order, what ended up producing was always economic chaos. And this went on from Mexico down to Argentina, also every country. You think about it, in the act that creates the US dollar as a currency in 1792, the US dollar, the Act of Congress reads that the US dollar will have the silver content of a Spanish colonial peso. And it's written that way. And it remained that way for almost 2 centuries. The Mexican peso and the Spanish colonial peso were legal tender in the United States until 1857, by law. In 1950, if you look at the currencies, one Argentinian peso was $1, one Cuban peso was $1, one Mexican peso was $1, and so on. They still remain the same over the centuries. Now think of the chaos if what bought $1 in the United States in 1950, what $1 bought, now you needed $1 million. Not 100 or 200, $1 million. That's what happened in Argentina. Here's a million peso note of a country that in 1950 had parity with the dollar. And the other bill is a $500,000 Cruzeiro note. I actually keep at home a 1.2 billion Cruzeiro bill in Brazil. Okay, and this what happened was politicians saying, yes, you want change. What do you want? Yes, we'll give it to you. You want money? I'll give you money. You know, all kinds of subsidies. We'll give you the subsidies. But in these countries, you didn't have the endless credit of the US government. Eventually, they collapse. These are pyramids that collapse. These are Ponzi schemes. And that's what happened everywhere. It's happening today in Venezuela. And that's what's going on. And the problem now is not only Latin America. I think as the world becomes more democratic, because Latin America has this search for democracy. Democracy has been an aim of the Latin Americans for generations. Look what's happening in Greece. The Greeks are about to commit economic suicide for the same reasons. You know, the people who want order for Greece cannot convince those who want change now to wait. And Greece is about to go the Latin American way. So that's a way to understand the conflict in Latin America when you think about Greece. Okay, these people are tired of being told, no, wait, austerity will be just a few years longer. So after economic chaos comes, this call to order is always popular for a time. And that's the reason for the military dictatorships. Always, almost at every turn, when you see a military dictator come, with a few exceptions, there's Somozas in Nicaragua and so on, there are exceptions to the rule, is always after a period of economic chaos and after a period of a group of very democratic, very well-intentioned politicians wrecking the economy. And that's where these dictators come. Latin America has changed a lot in the last 30 years. I mean, you look at Latin America 30 years ago, only Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico, well, Mexico partially because of PRI, were democracies. Now it's the opposite. Now only Cuba and Venezuela are probably the only ones who are not democracies. So Latin America has changed a lot, and democracy is cherished. People realized in most countries, you know, we have to be careful with this cherished institution that is democracy. So there is a change of attitudes, and there's some effort to be more responsible. Let's see how long that lasts, though. You know. And only two countries are dictatorships, Cuba and Venezuela. Societies are very modern. This is another misconception. You know, people think of Latin America, this machista continent where women are, you know, mistreated and so forth. Yes, there is mistreatment of women. There's no question, as there is in Spain too. But in reality, the societies are very modern. Violeta Chamorro was president of Nicaragua 25 years ago. And there's a whole bunch of, just put two pictures there of women who are presidents of their countries. And the same thing of inclusive. Yes, there's racism, particularly in the upper classes in Latin America. That's absolutely true. But societies are very inclusive. Again, you know, you have full-blooded indigenous people become president of their countries, or black presidents or whatever. The middle class is rising. And this, I mean, the concept of the mall and so forth is enormous. I mean, the Brazilian car market is one of the largest in the world. We're going on with examples. And the diversity is much more than people think. There is over 2 million people of Japanese descent in Brazil. Okay, and I could go on and on with examples, you know, and it's a much more diverse continent that people realize. And the most important thing is that it's 500 million people, that buy 50% more US products than China does. I mean, think of the number. People think of China as this being this great market for US products. It's a great market, it's a great investment for US companies. But Latin American markets as a market are much larger. And if you think US manufactured products, it's almost 3 times as much. Latin America buys almost 3 times as much as China does. And yet, hardly anybody knows that in this country. Almost 1/3 of all visitors to the United States are from Latin America. Again, the number is 50% more Brazilians come to this country than Chinese do. And the number of Venezuelans visiting the US last year was equal to the number of people from India. So that's just a picture of, what you have next door that you haven't realized that you have next door. As I said, populist politicians remain a threat. These guys want to gain power and stay in power by, selling the house furniture and, burning down the house. And they're still out there. And throughout the region, this is a perception of American attitude towards the region. Really, I mean, you ask Latin America, what do Americans think of Latin America? They don't think about Latin America. That's the answer. And the reason is, there are reasons like this. This is an actual front page of the New York Post, and I could have picked any paper in America that day. The Pussy Riot jail term by Putin putting the Pussy Riot group in jail. It made the front page of every paper in America. All these rock stars, in Russia were sent to prison for so-called indecent acts in a church. I mean, it was ridiculous, I agree. But it made the front page. US trade with Russia is negligible compared to US trade with Latin America. You think about it, other than the nuclear weapons, which is an important issue, but there are no major geopolitical issues for the US with Russia, other than defending little countries around, so forth. And yet, when a former Miss Venezuela contestant gets a bullet through her head from a policeman who wants to end a protest, from a police sniper, he wasn't just a policeman on the street with a gun, he was a sniper, or a former presidential candidate or a senator in Venezuela get almost beaten to death by government thugs in what used to be one of the most stable democracies in the world, doesn't make the papers in this country. Despite the fact that people know about a whole bunch of Latin Americans. That's Fernando Botero and Michelle Munchen there, and of course, you have a whole bunch more. You have Rafael Reif there, who was born in Maracaibo, Venezuela. And, these people are well known. I mean, the cultural exchange with Latin America is huge. But we don't happen to make the news. I mean, the Lithuanian democracy is important, but the Ecuadorian democracy is not. I mean, I give an example. If tomorrow the governor of Lithuania closed down 50 radio stations because they were speaking badly about the president, it would make the front page of the New York Times. When the president of Ecuador did just that, it didn't come out in the papers at all. And to me, it's surprising because the US trade and economic and cultural interests are much more aligned with Latin America than with Lithuania. So there's a problem. That's the reason why I founded a website that now we're lucky that we now have 4 million unique visitors a year and so forth. We're growing only 18 months, but we discovered a niche. Nobody's reporting Latin America in English. And the last thing, my last comment is US re-engagement would help. I was talking about this with a group of students from Tepper, and a group of them were Mexicans. And they laughed when I said this because they were thinking in historical terms. I mean, I got their laugh, and I agree that, this is, US re-engagement helps from the 1950s on. You have to remember that for the Mexicans, the Mexicans consider US took away half their territory. But U.S. re-engagement would help. When the U.S. has been engaged, it has been a great help to the region. U.S. can be a great example to the region, and it has been a good influence. And I put up 3 examples. One is the FDR government that towards the end, towards the 1940s, he named Nelson Rockefeller his envoy for Latin America. He was incredibly effective. And there were a lot of advancements done in Latin America for democracy and for other issues because of the FDR engagement with Latin America. The other one is the Kennedy Initiative, the Alliance for Progress, and so forth in the 60s. Yes, it was Cold War driven. Yes, it was part of a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. But it was well executed. It was, and it had positive results. Another one is the Bush Senior. Only Clinton is there with President Pastrana of Colombia. The other one is the Bush Senior Clinton years, which saw a lot of engagement with Latin America. So at the presidential level, I mean, there was interest in Latin America, and that produced results. That helped democratization, it helped institutions, it helped markets, and so forth. The past 15 years have been the opposite. It's been total neglect of Latin America, as if it did not exist. But those are examples of periods when the U.S. has been a very positive influence in the region. And my final comment is on this myth of anti-Americanism. I talked about this a little bit with a group of students. Some people think the United States is unpopular in Latin America. That's completely untrue. The United States is wildly popular in Latin America. Not only the Americans per se, as people say that Russians don't like the United States, but when an American goes to Moscow, he's really popular. It's not only that, it's that the United States as a country is popular. These things of the United Fruit Company and the invasion of Nicaragua in the 30s, this is not relevant to the Latin American today. People look up to the United States, people like the country, people like the freedom, people like the modernity of the United States. There's probably 1 or 2 exceptions to that rule. One is Argentina, where if you talk to anybody in Argentina, just get into a cab driver in Buenos Aires and ask him his opinion about the United States, and he'll go on and on, And the reason is the events of the early 2000s, when after a period where Argentina was a very close ally to the US, it sent troops to Iraq with the American government and so forth. When Argentina is viewed from the Argentinian average man on the street, when Argentina needed help, the US told them to go to hell. And that's the attitude in Argentina. But that's an exception to the rule. Generally, the US is extremely popular. So generally, any ideas coming from the US, exchange with the US, extremely popular. I'm going to stop here. I think I went over the time. Yeah. But I haven't touched on certain issues there, but I think there's one issue that is critical for Latin America, which I didn't touch on very much, which has to be with the rule of law. Latin American countries, Brazil is a vibrant democracy, Colombia is a vibrant democracy, even Argentina is a vibrant democracy. But what's lacking in Latin America in many ways is the rule of law. The resources dedicated to the judicial system everywhere are tiny, and that produces all kinds of vices and weaknesses in the rule of law. And the other thing is crime. If you think about it, the only region of the world where crime is really a major issue is Latin America. And this has to do also with this utopian desire for this endless welfare state on one side. Because what happens is, while governments give away money for all kinds of things, let's fight poverty, let's take care of the elderly, let's give great pensions and so forth, they have no money left for the police. And the problem is, I'll give you an example, and this is before the days of Hugo Chavez. Caracas, in the mid-60s, was one of the safest cities on earth. Actually, there's a quote that I have in another presentation from the Chase Manhattan Bank saying, put your Latin American operations in Venezuela because Caracas is the safest environment of any city in Latin America, and it's the most modern, it's got the best airport and so forth, but it's the safest. Caracas had 10,000 police for 1.3 million people that lived in the city in 1965. In 1997, that's 32 years later, the city had 6 million people and still had the same 10,000 policemen. Of course, crime skyrocketed. And the example of Caracas, you can go city by city in Latin America. It's a similar example. So that's a major issue that is not hardly talked about, but it's a major issue because where you have insecurity, in terms of common crime, you have low investment and so forth, you have more poverty and so forth. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.
So given a couple of minutes for people to make their way out if they have to leave and they have other commitments, are you willing to take a few questions?
Sure, of course, please.
Yes.
Welcome to questions. Yes.
Questions?
Will you explain to us why Argentina is the way it is? Repeat the question, please.
Why is Argentina the way it is? Well, Argentina is a very complex country. Argentina wasn't even a unified country until 1853. I mean, they got independent from Spain, and then they had every province declared themselves a country, pretty much. So it's a large place. Argentina is a product. First of all, Argentina had this, let's say, wars of civilization, which are wars of extermination of their native peoples in the 19th century, and they had the policy of Europeanizing the country, and they were very successful from the 19th century. Millions and millions of immigrants from Spain and Italy and even Scotland and Germany went to Argentina, and Argentina became very European. It looks more European than the other countries in Latin America for that reason. You wiped out your native population and you brought in millions of Europeans. And that was the purpose of what they were doing. So initially they were extremely successful. You have probably the most productive land anywhere in the world, the Pampas, in terms of agriculture. And you have the perfect weather. You have everything that for agriculture to grow. And by 1914, they were the fourth richest country on earth in terms of per capita income. What happened in Argentina is they kept receiving immigrants. These immigrants, the wave of immigrants they were receiving in the 20th century were immigrants that were coming with their own ideas from Europe. They wanted to unionize, they wanted workers' rights, they wanted welfare, they wanted a whole bunch of things that Argentina was not giving them. And when the Great Depression came around, which hit Argentina very hard when agricultural prices collapsed, the mixture of this, let's say, new class of people who were coming from Europe with these ideas, with the economic crisis, produced this incredible instability. And they ended up electing what is literally, they brought in the plague. They elected Perón. Perón was elected to power, former army colonel who gets elected to power. And Perón, whose hero was Mussolini, starts to emulate Mussolini in terms of populism and in terms also of creating a what we call hegemonic political organization. Actually, so much so that Hugo Chavez in person told me once, he told me that he was very interested in how Perón was able to come to power without a political organization and then create a political organization that would dominate Argentinian politics for 70 years. And these are words said to me by Hugo Chavez. He created this political organization in a state that it was populism to an extreme probably not seen in the world until that day. When he got to power, Argentina had the world's largest gold reserves. It was seen as a country that could not go bankrupt. And he actually, in 11 years in power, he bankrupted the country. He actually established beef rationing in the world's biggest beef-producing nation at the time. And it was just giving money out the window. But the thing is, when you're receiving out of that money, and if you are I mean, if somebody in some parts of the United States, you know, some districts of New Orleans, you know, stood like Evita Perón there with bills, giving thousands of dollars to everybody who needed. Oh, I need a new house. Here, have the bill in a cash. Buy a new house. Here's the bills. You become popular to an extent. And this tradition of populism in Argentina is what I think has poisoned Argentina. And they're in a vicious cycle, because when they try to breathe out of that, something happens that brings the voters back to the populists, and then they go back the cycle and so forth. It's a very difficult proposition, and actually the worse the country gets, the more difficult it is to get out of it. It's very hard to get back on a virtuous cycle. But Argentina, in my opinion, is one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, you go to Argentina and you say, this country should be France or Germany. And it's really a mystery. But I think the European ideas that came in the 20th century, mixed with the populism, were a deadly combination that Argentina hasn't been able to shake. That's as much as I can explain about that.
How much do demographics matter? So we've talked about U.S. re-engagement. With the future demographic changes in this country, do you see that also changing maybe more interest in Central and Latin America with the kind of increasing influence, political, economic, social, of Hispanics in the United States?
Well, first of all, you know, somebody asked me that question earlier. There's not such thing as a Latin American demographic vis-a-vis the U.S. A Mayan from Guatemala who lives in Florida has literally no relation to a Cuban American in Miami. I mean, the Mayan from Guatemala is more similar to a Native American in Arizona than he is to the Cuban in Miami. So in terms of you know, demographics, you know, there's no such thing. The only common thing is the language, Spanish. And you still have the Portuguese who don't even speak, I mean, the Brazilians don't even speak Spanish. So that's one thing to understand. So, I mean, if your question relates to the U.S. and the demographics of the U.S., I think it's irrelevant. I mean, when you are in the Marines, for example, Sergeant Hernandez and Sergeant Smith, they're both Marines with the Marines ethos and the Marines outlook to life. And that's exactly what's going to happen, and it's happening in the US already. Because unlike what happens in Europe with Muslim immigrants in Europe, which are alien to the culture, even the Mayan immigrant in Florida from Guatemala, he's Western. He's Western in ethos, he's Western in religion, he's Western in desires, and he's Western in outlook. He will assimilate like the Italians assimilate. I gave that example earlier to a group of students. Said, if you've seen the Godfather movies, the first Godfather movie, remember the Italian neighborhood? In the first Godfather movie where, you know, the Godfather is with his baby there in that Italian neighborhood in New York. Everybody's speaking Italian. Nobody speaks English. There are Italian flags on the street. You know, they're parading with the Virgin Mary figure on the street. A generation later, you couldn't tell who was Italian there. And that's exactly what's going to happen and is happening in the US with the Latin American population. So it's a demographics issue for the first generation. But eventually, it's not an issue. They'll be Americans like everybody else. And they won't vote similarly. They won't think similarly. You know, I mean, just a group of, let's say, Hispanic voters. Again, it's already not like that. You know, a group of Mexicans in Chicago do not vote in the same manner or think in the same way as a group of people from Puerto Rico in New York. To me, it's a non-issue. There's no demographic issue there.
One more question.
Yeah.
How about crime in Latin America? Like rising, having some of like the highest crime rates in the world,
Yeah.
and then needing investment to be able to like alleviate the poverty. Like, you need money to fight crime, but you cannot reduce the crime if you don't have the money to invest in the police, to strengthen institutions. So So how do you see that going? I mean, some countries have improved, like Honduras increasing like their border rates year, but still increasing in other countries.
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways. One is, problem with crime in Latin America is a problem inherent to democracy. And if you think about what happened in New York City in the 70s, where New York was a very dangerous city. I was mugged in New York in the 70s. And what happened in New York was the same thing that's happening in Latin America. The city of New York was spending all this money on these social programs and on different programs that seemed, very worthwhile. Oh no, we have to take care of the elderly. We have to take care of the homeless. We have to take care of this. But money is a finite amount. And they would not spend what needed to be spent, and the mayors did not win elections on helping out the police. So New York went on a downward spiral in terms of criminality until it got out of hand, and finally somebody came up and reacted. Same thing is the same reason in Latin America. It is not popular, particularly in countries that had dictatorships in the past, to spend money on the police. Okay? You have seen the conflicts even recently in the U.S. between police and certain groups of people. Those conflicts are much more heightened in Latin America in a way. So for a mayor or a governor or a president to say, I'm going to spend a ton of money on the police and maybe not spend as much money in hospitals, he'd be booted out of office. So this has been going on for a while. And it's the same as in the New York process. Things are getting worse from bad to worse. What in some societies have not realized yet is what the Colombians realized. Colombians realized is we cannot hope to fix the problems of this country. We don't start with security. And the fact that Colombia has been largely pacified is not only that they cornered the FARC guerrillas, is that they diminished greatly common crime. I mean, Bogota used to be I had business in Bogota. I've been traveling to Bogota for 30 years. Bogota used to be an extremely dangerous city. I would not wear a watch in Bogota, okay? Now, the first sign that I saw that Bogota had turned a corner is when McDonald's announced it was going to open 24 hours. Yeah, because before that, McDonald's wouldn't open late in Bogota because they would get an armed robbery when McDonald's said we're opening 24 hours, to me that was the signal. Colombia is now a different country. And they managed to do it. And with security came investment. Investment just skyrocketed with security. And I have a bet with a friend of mine right now that if a peace agreement is signed with FARC, the Colombian peso is going to revalue. So watch out for those of you who trade on foreign exchange. It's really, security brings investment. And we have the opposite problems in places like Honduras, which is the world's most dangerous country in terms of common crime. But the issue is an issue inherent to democracy. Okay? And we haven't solved that issue. And again, that's where U.S. can help. Colombia was able to turn the country, the corner in a large part because of the President Clinton supported the Plan Colombia, where U.S. was giving $1 billion a year for security to Colombia. The Colombians were able to, without diminishing their social programs or help to the poor or whatever, spend $1 billion more on security. It made a huge difference for Colombia. And so that's one example of U.S. engagement in a particular area, and it was just $1 billion a year, which, I mean, in terms of the U.S., what the U.S. does around the world, it was, chicken feed, literally. But the results were great. Thank you.
That was a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.